Executive Director of Faith and Prejudice. We are so delighted that you have decided to join us for part one of our Overcoming Polarization series. Tonight's conversation will be about why are we polarized? We have an amazing presenter for you all tonight. But before we jump in, I wanted to first introduce my colleague, who I'm sure most of you already know, Anna Stamborski. She's the Director of Strategic Partnerships. She's on the call and would love actually to hear from you all. So at this moment, if you would please post your name, location where you're joining us from, and a one sentence that says, what do you hope to learn from tonight's session in the chat? Again, that's your name, your location, and what you hope to learn from tonight's session. So if you go ahead and put that in the chat, and I'll read them as those responses come in live. So actually, I'll share mine. So I'm Antoine. I'm from Nashville, and I would love to learn some tools of how I can engage, or actually better engage with people who don't necessarily align with me politically. Is it Eno or Eno? You can feel free to correct me, but Eno from Minneapolis or Minnesota says how to talk to conservatives. John Peterson says solve all the world's problems. That is a big ask for tonight's session. I'm not sure we'll accomplish that, but we can always dream. Anna says, wonder if we are indeed polarized now than before. That's a great question. Kendra from Wisconsin says places where there is or can be common ground. Stephanie O'Brien from Minneapolis says, I'm hoping to get some practical takeaways to share with my congregation this summer. That's good. I really hope that you're able to walk away with some of those. Donna from Twin Cities says to learn the whys of polarization. Christina, a sense of imagination for our shared humanity in the midst of tension and conflict. That's good. Dan, the structural drivers of polarization. These are coming in fast. Kelly, interested in hearing analysis and tools to talk to those who feel in opposition to me and I, them. And Christine says all of the above. So these are some amazing hopes for tonight's session. Nathan, you have a lot of pressure on you, but I'm sure you are up to the task. And so before we jump into tonight's session, I want to formally introduce our presenter this evening, Mr. Nathan Stock. And so I'm going to read his bio really quickly for you all, and then I will pass it over to him. So Nathan Stock is starting in the summer of 2020. Nathan Stock designed a new Carter Center project to mitigate political and identity-based violence in the United States. Through this work, he is building diverse networks of citizens from across the political spectrum to serve as community advocates for electoral democracy and the peaceful resolution of disputes. He is also working to strengthen community infrastructure for violence mitigation.
Yeah, I'm in my meeting now.
Violence mitigation, building trust and connections across various lines of differences. Stock has taught undergraduate courses on political dialogue in the U.S. and published on U.S. polarization. In addition to this work on U.S. conflicts, Stock is a non-resident scholar with the Middle East Institute. He has nearly 15 years, he has 15 years of experience working to reduce violence and strengthen democracy abroad, including nearly a decade working on Middle Eastern conflicts with the Carter Center. Stock has written extensively on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He's lived and worked in Afghanistan, Gaza, and China, and he holds a Master of Arts in International Peace and Conflict Resolution from American University, as well as a Bachelor's of Arts in International Relations from Colgate University. And so if you would, please join me in welcoming Nathan Stock. You can use your Zoom reaction. You can drop it in the chat, but want to pass it over to Nathan Stock.
Thanks, Antoine. Thank you for the kind introduction. Thanks, Anna, for organizing tonight, and all of you for coming out to give us your time. We're really grateful. So I really appreciate the list of lofty goals articulated for the next 55 minutes. I don't think we will realize all of them. But remember, this is part one of part two. And this is going to be the more depressing part. We're going to mostly talk about what's wrong. If you want to be less depressed, you got to tune in next week for the good part on how we fix it, right? But tonight, we're going to do a few things. We're going to talk about some of these, as someone mentioned, structural drivers of polarization, changes in our country and that have created conditions conducive to polarization. We'll talk about our brains, our neurology, the unique ways in which we humans evolved to think and exist in tribal groups. And then we'll talk specifically about violence. Why has the United States seen this rise in political violence since 2016? And we'll close with a few takeaways that I hope will not be totally depressing. And throughout this presentation, I'm going to stop and ask you questions. So I will know if you are paying attention or not. And we should have some time for discussion at the end. So with that, first thing I want to share is this handy graph, courtesy of the folks at Pew. This is Pew, who do the survey research, right? So the takeaway here is they have been asking the same battery of questions to Americans about our political views, our policy preferences. They've been asking the same questions for a long, long time. And what you're seeing here is how Americans answered those questions going back to 1994, cross-referenced by different demographic characteristics. So you have here a line for their party affiliation, whether they were Democrat or Republican, race, I think the sample is Black and white Americans, religious attendance, do they attend like a church or something or not, age, gender, education level, etc. This slide arguably encapsulates the way in which our political identity has become so determinative in understanding our policy preferences, right? If you look at this slide, as recently as 1994, one's race in America was 1 point more predictive of one's political views than one's party affiliation, right? Fast forward to 2017, and party identity has pulled away from these other aspects of people's identities, their race, whether or not they're religious, their gender. It has become much more predictive of Americans' policy preferences and their political views. This graph essentially illustrates something we're going to talk a lot about this evening, which is this process of partisan sorting, where Americans have sort of sorted into these two mega polarized tribes. Okay, so I am of the belief that if you are an American and you live in this country, you are entitled to an opinion on this. So before I start to yammer on at you, I'd be curious for people's thoughts. This idea of structural drivers, these are changes in America, right? And we live in a time of change. New technology, right? New communication technology. We have had demographic change in this country, right? Country's less white. Lots of things going on in the last few years. In your daily experiences, what do you think is driving this polarization? What jumps out at you guys? You can use the button to raise your hand. You can just call out.
Social media silos.
Media silos. Thank you. Yep, we're going to talk about that for sure. Other thoughts?
Geographic sorting.
Geographic sorting. Yeah, I see Eno has a hand up.
Wealth gap.
Wealth gap. Yep. Any other thoughts?
There's a couple thoughts in the chat as well.
Okay.
One says media forces that use emotional language to drive fear and polarization.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, I knew you guys were going to be a smart audience. You're ahead of the curve. So yeah, I think everything you just. Oh yeah, Cheryl, did you want to share? It's hard. It's hard to hear you, unfortunately.
The structural racism that is already there, that's being seen more. It's more visible now.
Yeah, structural racism. Yeah, so I think you guys, you may have hit every single item on my list here. So these are the things that jump out to me based on the literature on these issues, but also my experience of my work. You mentioned structural racism. Another way to think about that is, how has America becoming less white, which it definitely has over the last 40 years, how is that impacting these trends, right? So the first item here is just quoting data from the US Census Bureau. The language the Census Bureau uses is the foreign-born population, right? What percentage of folks who are here weren't born here? And that percentage by, the last few years has grown to levels that the US hasn't seen in about 100 years, since the last peak of immigration in the early 20th century.
Oh, wow. We're getting beat bad.
Could I ask everybody to mute, just because we're getting some occasional interference on the line? So the point I'd like to make here, and we'll share these slides when we're done. There are a bunch of footnotes in these slides, so you can kind of use this as an annotated bibliography if you want to read more about these topics. But the first item in the footnote here is this book by Eric Kaufman called White Shift. So he's an academic in London, and basically he looks at the role of immigration and demographic change across multiple democracies, and argues, I think pretty persuasively, that this fear of change, either there actually is immigration, or maybe there's not even that much immigration, but politicians use it as a kind of boogeyman, is a major consistent factor unsettling a lot of democracies, not just ours. So this is one factor I'd put in here. Someone had mentioned a moment ago closed media ecosystems. That's definitely a part of the story, right? I don't think I need to spend too much time on this, but we live in a world wherein Americans today increasingly lack a shared basis of facts, right? This really goes back to the 1980s, the rise of partisan radio, and then we have partisan cable TV news, and now Facebook algorithms, so that we increasingly consume a media diet that reinforces many of our pre-existing beliefs and makes it harder as a country to come together and have a shared national discussion. Someone else had mentioned the wealth gap. I think that's definitely part of the story. Another book that's footnoted below is Yascha Monk's work, The People versus Democracy. And he's got this great stat in there. I think it's from 1935 to 1960, the income of the typical American household doubled. And then from 60 to 1985, it doubled again. That is the story of my grandpa, right? When he got married to my grandma, they lived in a room in a boarding house. By the time he retired in the 1980s, they owned a house on a couple acres. They had an RV that they tooled around the country in, and they had a little postage stamp cottage in Florida, right? I mean, my grandfather's working life as a welder in the 20th century was a case study in how American democracy and American capitalism delivered for working people in this country. And I think it's fair to say the economy has not worked that way for the vast majority of Americans for a long time. Yes, we saw a little bit of that gap close with the changes in the economy coming out of COVID, but in general, the concentration of wealth in our country has been very significant for decades now. Why does that matter? Well, there's a whole political science literature about revolutions, right? Why was there a revolution in Iran in 1979, as an example? One of the consistent findings there is not just that deprivation or poverty or oppression triggers anger and revolution. It is that the combination of perception, people's perception that they should be better off than they are, or that the oppressor is illegitimate, that gap between the perception and their reality, that is very destabilizing. I grew up in a 1 square mile town about an hour from Buffalo, New York. It was too small for traffic lights. And I see this in the community I grew up in. I grew up with lots of people who are finding it difficult to achieve the standard of living that their parents achieved, right? That makes people angry. and is certainly a part of the story of what's unsettling our politics and driving these divisions. I would add declining trust in institutions. There's a lot of data on this. Gallup has been surveying Americans every year since Nixon was in the White House. And they ask Americans, well, what do you trust? Do you trust banks? Do you trust big business? Do you trust newspapers? Do you trust the courts, the military? And generally speaking, trust in all of these institutions has basically been declining since the Nixon administration. Why is that a problem? Well, for one thing, it makes it harder to have that national conversation around shared facts if the institutions that are supposed to bring those facts aren't trusted. It also is another factor that is pulling us back into these smaller, more tribal corners for our information and for our communities. And then finally, and someone mentioned this, geographic sorting, right? There's a whole book on this. It's worth reading. It's footnoted below Bill Bishop's book, The Big Sort. It's true. I mean, since circa 1980, Americans have been moving to live in communities where their neighbors vote the same way they do. And this data was clear when Bishop wrote this book in the mid-aughts. The trend was very clear. It's even more true now. Why does that matter? Well, it means that many Americans in the course of their daily lives at work or taking their kids to a Little League game or in the grocery store are less likely to bump into other Americans who have different politics than they do. That matters because in turn, it's just easier to demonize or at least caricature people based on their politics when you're not actually engaging with them, as a person, a friend, or a neighbor, right? So let me pause there. Does that make sense to folks? I mean, how does that land? Is there anything I missed on this list? I mean, there's, we could spend the whole night talking about this stuff, but, other major things you might add? All right. Well, then let's talk about the other side of the story, psychological and behavioral drivers of polarization. So, the first point I want to impress is that we happen to live in this historical moment when a number of factors have come together in our country to create conditions conducive to the polarization we're experiencing. Those environmental factors are colliding with our very human brains. Turns out, arguably, our brains are wired to divide into groups. And again, this could be another whole evening's worth of discussion, but the first point I would make, and this comes from Jonathan Haidt's still excellent book, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. He makes the point that we are intuitive creatures. We're designed for groupish righteousness, right? We have feelings. Based on those feelings, we make decisions. And then our rational human brains kick in and create justifications for the decisions we made based on the feelings we have, not the other way around, right? None of us are perfectly, magically impartial computers. We all have feelings. We all engage in motivated reasoning. None of us are as rational as we might like to think. And of course, this crosses party lines. This is true for all humans, right? That's the first point I'd make. I would add a couple more pieces to this equation. And again, there's a lot that could be said here. But the first is this idea that belonging is more important than facts. So imagine that we evolved in bands of 30 or so. We were hunting and gathering, right? And our first goal was to ensure that we didn't get eaten by, like a saber-toothed tiger or something, right? Job number one. Therefore, your relationship to your group was very important, right? Less likely to get eaten, presumably, if you're in your group of people, lots of people with spears and clubs, right? If you are out alone, you're more likely to be in danger, right? This speaks to a deeper truth about how our brains work. We're wired for belonging. We all human beings need to feel that they belong to something, to groups, that they're trusted and respected. It is a profoundly deep human need. And those needs for belonging and the trust of your group and the esteem of your group can often override our ability to assess objective facts, right? That's the first point I'd make here. Second, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it's really worth looking at Haidt's book. He's a social psychologist, and he explores how it is that people make decisions about what's right and wrong. Why? How do we know that? Why do some people think that X act is moral and others feel that it's immoral? Why would human beings have any differences of opinion on that? So the short version is he comes up with this 5-part scale for unpacking how we make moral judgments. He argues that all human beings make decisions about whether action X is right or wrong based on some combination of these 5 factors. Care, harm. Is someone being cared for or harmed? Fairness, cheating. It's pretty obvious. Is it fair or someone being cheated? Loyalty, betrayal. Is there an element of loyalty to this? Is there loyalty to one's group versus betrayal that has to be considered? Related to that is the idea of deference to authority versus subverting authority. And then finally, he has this sort of sanctity degradation, right? And here you get into questions of like clean and unclean in this more ritual sense, right? And think for a minute about all the world's great religions, some of which have built very complex systems to adjudicate these things. Orthodox Judaism, Hinduism, right? There's lots of rules around what is considered clean and unclean, right? This comes from somewhere, is it part innate to how we make decisions about right and wrong. Okay, he comes up with this 5-part typology. Then he does a bunch of research. He interviews, different cohorts of people in 3 different countries, including the United States. He finds that people who skew liberal in India and the United States and Brazil, they tend to make decisions about right and wrong based on items 1 and 2. Is someone being harmed or not? And is it like fair? Is there an equitable distribution of stuff? He finds that people who skew more conservative across those 3 countries, they're sensitive to numbers 1 and 2 as well, but they're more sensitive than the liberals to these questions of loyalty, authority, and sanctity. And he then argues that if this is true, and it's, that humans are sort of born with this underlying architecture that helps us navigate the world and make these moral decisions, it doesn't take too much of a leap to begin to consider how this impacts our politics, how it impacts who we vote for, what messages from what candidates resonate, right? So that's one thing. There are documented differences in moral decision making between people who skew liberal and skew conservative. And I'm not saying one is right or wrong. It's just that there are these differences and they run pretty deep. Okay, relatedly, there is a new sort of emerging body of political science that is looking at the intersection between neurology, brain science, and then our politics and our polarization. And in this work, and this book is now 10 years old, it's written by 3 political scientists, these guys argue that there's some combination of our genetics, our early childhood experiences, other life experiences that leave us with subconscious patterns in how we respond to our environments, to stimuli, right? And they argue that if you look at samples of liberal and conservative Americans, there are certain patterns in which liberals and conservatives seem to experience these sort of subconscious responses in different ways. So they find that conservatives tend to be more sensitive to threat. They're more animated or responsive to potential threats in their environment. People who skew more liberal tend to be more animated or excited by variety and newness of experience, right? Here again, if you think about this for 2 seconds, like it's very easy to begin to see how, if it's true that human beings kind of naturally, our brains kind of sort into these 2 types of brains, or at least the combination of our brains and our life experiences gives us these different response patterns, this would impact our politics, right? Once I read this book, I mean, I sort of thought back over my life and various life experiences that I understood more clearly having read this work. One example is in the mid-aughts, I lived in Afghanistan for a couple of years. I was working on a US government-funded aid project. And in those days in Afghanistan, in Kabul, there were a handful of bars, mostly catering to foreigners. There's this one place where you could get a Heineken and like the worst taco you've ever eaten, like just really bad, like worse than anything you've ever had. It's just a terrible taco, but you know, it's Afghanistan. There's a war going on. We're desperate, you know, whatever. So I had gone to the bar. I had my crappy taco. I had my Heineken. Coming out of the bar, and to get out of the bar, you have to go through like a security check where there's a weapons locker. Because a lot of the guys who'd come to the bar were armed because they were like private security contractors, right? But they weren't allowed to bring their weapons into the bar because, you know, beer, guns, not a great combination, right? So I'm leaving the bar. This other dude is next to me. Obviously, he's a fellow American. He's recovering his sidearm from the weapons locker. He looks at me and he's like, "Oh, you're not armed." And I said, "No, you know, I work for this nonprofit and, you know, the security situation right now in the Afghan capital is not too bad. So we don't have armed security when we're in the city, when we're in Kabul." And this guy looked at me like I had six heads. Like he believed deeply that I had a death wish. And he said to me, he said, "Listen, if you walk out that door without a weapon, you are taking your life into your own hands." And in that moment, at some very deep level, I felt in my bones that he and I were just different. Think about it. We have the same data. We both lived in a war zone in the city of Kabul. Let's not kid ourselves. It's not like there's no danger. But we had the same experience, and at a very deep level, we responded to it very differently, right? And to be clear, I'm not saying that like he's wrong and I'm right. There's no black and white answer to it. All I know is we felt differently at a very profound level, and I don't know how else to explain it other than that, you know, we're kind of different, right? So last slide I want to share on this theme. So to take this research a step further, this is from an academic journal article, and that was also written up in a New York Times piece in the last year or two. They're both footnoted here. So in case what I just said wasn't depressing enough, let's just make it more depressing. There are smarter people than me now arguing that there is such a thing as neural polarization. So get this, these smart scientists, they took a sample of Americans. They had sort of asked them some opening questions to type them politically. So they knew, you know, in the sample, they were like half skewed liberal, half skewed conservative, right? And then the sample of people, the liberals and the conservatives, they all watched a series of videos. They all watched the same videos about immigration, short videos, right? Why immigration? Well, people have strong feelings about immigration. It's very emotive. Everybody watches the same videos. While they're watching, they have their brains scanned in an MRI. And guess what, guys? The liberals in the sample and the conservatives in the sample had different parts of their brains light up in response to the exact same video content, right? Okay, so the point I want to make here is, you know, this stuff is deep. It's deep. This is more than just, oh, you know, I don't get along with my uncle. I think I don't like him because he watches too much MSNBC or too much Fox. There is a growing body of evidence to suggest that we are all responding to our political and media environment in ways that may be somewhat subconscious and that certainly contribute to the polarized moment we're in. Let me pause there. What do you all think about this? All right. I'd be curious, you know, if any of you have had experiences like this where you're, you know, with somebody and you see yourself just responding to the same set of circumstances in very different ways.
The argument that you pose with regards to the person who left the bar with you in Afghanistan, as I posted in the chat, is very similar to that which you have folks staked out on both sides of gun rights. We all live in America. We all, and particularly in the communities in which we live, access to the same data with regards to crimes against persons, and we stake out polar opposite positions based on our values and beliefs.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
So the thing that strikes me though is biology hasn't, I don't think, changed drastically in the last 50 years. Right?
Yeah.
So this is an element of what's going on, but kind of what gives me hope is, okay, if there's some biological stuff here, there's probably ways to deal with that.
Yes, I totally agree with that. I mean, let's do a thought experiment for a second, guys. And I think many of you are old enough to remember a different media world in the United States. Let's just imagine for a second it's 2024 and there are 3 TV news channels. It's 1980 in terms of the media diet. I'm going to go out on a limb and say our politics would be very different, right? Not only that, there is comparative data right now. Other democracies that aren't in the trouble we're in, one of the things they have going for them is a more stable, trusted, consensus-based media landscape, right? I mean, it's sort of embarrassing to say this, but one example is Germany. One of the things that our government did when we rebuilt Germany out of the Nazis was we made them invest in public media, like our version of PBS and public radio, but with a lot more money. So that today, there is a very credible, sort of mainstream, careful journalists, public broadcasting outfit in Germany on TV and the radio that a significant majority of Germans still tune into. I mean, imagine if like 75% of Americans tuned into one sort of centrist, mainstream, credible media source every day. We used to be like that. Hasn't been like that in forever. But there are other democracies that are navigating the same broad tensions that we're navigating and faring a lot better. And I think one thing they have going for them is a less fractured and frankly more credible media environment. So yeah, you're right, Carolyn. I mean, I would argue, these to the extent that this is biological and we evolved in this way, I bet you there are very good reasons why groups of humans, remember, we're 30 of us trying not to get eaten by tigers. You needed some people in your band of 30 who were a little more sensitive to threat, and you needed those other people who were more like, I don't know, like loosey-goosey, like let's do new stuff, right? It's easy to imagine for the group to survive, you needed both of those perspectives. We've always needed each other, if you will. The question is, how do you manage these natural differences and still hold on to a healthy democracy? And I mean, America did this for a long time, so presumably we could do it again. Any one last comment on this, and then I want to share a few other thoughts.
It feels like, for me anyway, the difference that I see is this sort of reliance on the individual versus the reliance on the collective. And I don't know if that's like neurological as well, where there's this sort of liberal idea that all of us are here, and there's this conservative idea that I'm here. And it's like, it's my rights versus our rights. And I come at this from a religious perspective a lot, but it's not necessarily a religious perspective, I suppose. But it's just this sense of what I want rather than we get what we want. And is there a neurological basis for that that's along the lines that you're talking about, or is that something completely different?
I am not sure. I have not seen research to that effect. It doesn't mean it's not out there. But the relevant data point that springs to my mind is Scotland. I spent a lot of time there. I visited once. We had some friends who lived there. Scotland, in many ways, is a socially conservative place. I mean, more so than the United States. Gender roles, in some ways, it's a bit like America if you turn the clock back. Scotland has, political parties. It's got liberal parties, it's got conservative parties, right? I don't think there's a single political voice in Scotland that wants to ditch their public healthcare system, right? They have what we would call in this country a single member, public state health system. And they all agree on that. Conservatives in Scotland support that. So the point I would just make, Kevin, it's not a perfect answer to your question, but the boundaries of the discourse matter a lot, right? If there is a general sense in the body politic and in the media, in what you learn in school, that, as an example, like the needs of the many are important and maybe too much individualism could be harmful. Like, I don't think that's necessarily antithetical to conservatives. I'm not sure that's a liberal conservative thing, although I do agree that in our moment today, it does often break down along those lines, right? But I don't know. My instinct is to say it's more a function of media, culture, values. I mean, you can argue in our own country that's something that's changed over time, right? I mean, the sort of the stereotype of the 80s. I'm old enough to remember the 80s, right? This was the era when Donald Trump got his start, right? Greed was good, right? I mean, there was this shift in the culture coming out of the 60s that emphasized, individual rights and so on. So I'm not sure, but it's certainly part of the story. All right, if I may, I want to take this in a slightly different direction. Well, two things. So where does this leave us as a country in 2024? Here's a quote from another great book by Dr. Lily Mason. She's at Johns Hopkins. And her book from 2018 sums up really well the way in which partisan affiliation is now an uber tribe. There are, for at least for partisan Americans, there's a lot of people in the middle who just aren't partisan one way or the other. But for people who are partisan, your party affiliation is an overarching identity that often overlaps with religiosity, race, everything down to, what kind of pets people prefer. And so that's where we are today. And I think we've been there for some time. This is all why we're polarized, right? And we could talk more about this. You could say more, but I want to underscore polarization and political violence are not the same thing. Ours is not the only polarized democracy. Poland, super polarized, has not seen the rise in identity-based violence that we have seen since 2016, which begs the question, what's special about America that we have seen this particular rise in a certain kind of violence and threats and intimidation and so on since 2016? Now here we are, the conversation we're about to have, I would argue, is at the leading edge of the research on these questions. There are not simple or settled answers to these questions. Based on the stuff I read and my work in this field, I want to pull out the three things that jump out to me as the most salient. First thing is what I would call perceptions of righteousness and threat. Okay, here's another quote from yet another piece of political science work. This is from a short working paper by like a dozen eminent political scientists. And they set out to come up with a better term for what's happening in America, better than polarization. Because they argued that, I don't know, like it feels worse than that. Like this thing, the divide in the sense that the other guys are scary, they're my enemies, they're not just my opponents. This polarization is not sufficient to describe this phenomenon. So these smart folks came up with a different term. They said what's happening to America is something like political sectarianism. That the better metaphor here is religion. And I don't mean religion in the New Testament sense for the Christians on the call. This is what we would call Old Testament. This is smiting your enemy, Old Testament, right? My side is righteous. We are with the Lord, and they are wicked. They're a threat to my group, right? So these guys argue, and I think they're right, that especially for partisans on the right or the left, the far further right or further left, this is how they're experiencing this phenomenon of polarization, these deep political but also social divisions, as a kind of sectarianism where the other side is dangerous. Okay. That connects to certain specific phenomena that are happening for some American conservatives. So you may remember Donald Trump won the Electoral College in 2016, and there was a lot of ink spilled trying to understand how this happened in general, and in particular, what about these famous switcher voters, these people who voted for Obama twice, then they went and voted for Trump, not Hillary Clinton? How did this happen, right? A lot was written. There were people who talked about economic factors, which, we've talked about. I don't think it's not in the mix. But, a bunch of political scientists got to work on this. And this quote sums up, I think it's fair to say, where a lot of the academic literature landed. Status threat, right? That for some Americans, some folks, particularly if you were more conservative, particularly if you were white, if you were a more religious, practicing Christian conservative, you have seen the country changing in lots of ways. Country's less white, it's quantifiably less white and less religious. And that feels threatening, right? So these political scientists argued that this was ultimately a major driver for some of President Trump's support. This underlying idea, conscious or subconscious, that for some Americans who had historically have been dominant, since the colonial period, right? Basically, Christian identifying white guys have been in charge here, that was changing, that was threatening to them. And that in turn motivates some people to seek out a very different kind of politics. Now, I want to add to this conversation that there is a whole literature from the international conflict realm that supports this thesis, that supports the idea that for some Americans, these changes in our country feel threatening. Another quote from another group of smart people. These political scientists were really studying the outbreak of civil wars. They weren't, studying America, but they have this big data set of conflict onset events. When does one ethnic group go to war with another? When does a civil war start or insurgency? And they looked at, essentially every country around the world since 1946, I think. And what they found was that this same idea, group status downgrade, if there's a group in a country that has historically been in charge and then they lose power, or they think they might lose power, that is very destabilizing. Doesn't always mean there's violence, but it correlates to more violence, right? Classic example of this phenomenon is Iraq in 2003. We invaded Iraq and we unseated a minority government. Saddam Hussein was a Sunni and an Arab, an ethnic Arab religious Sunni. Sunni Arabs had ruled Iraq essentially for centuries, but they weren't the majority. We kicked that government out of power, and those Sunni Arabs of Iraq were real upset about that, and they formed the backbone of an insurgency, both targeting US forces, but also the new Iraqi government that was dominated by Shiites, who were the majority, or at least the larger ethno-confessional group. So the point I want to make here is not to single anybody out in America. I want to underscore that this sense of threat for dominant groups is super common. It's like normal in societies. Doesn't mean it's good. Doesn't mean we don't have to do something about it. But it's not at all unusual to America. All right, so we've talked about sense of perceptions of righteousness and threat. Next thing I want to talk about is the rhetoric of elites. This is a very important point. I really recommend the paper I've cited here. If you had to read one thing, read this paper by Rachel Kleinfeld. It really summarizes the state of the literature on a lot of this. Okay, this is another finding that for those of us who've worked abroad, worked on civil wars or armed conflicts abroad, it's very clear. Elites set the tone. Elites set the rules for what is permissible to do and say in a society. And when those signals from those leaders change, when those leaders signal that, oh, you know, that group over there, they're coming to get us. They're coming to get us. There's horrifying evidence from around the world that that correlates to violence and sometimes even genocide. The classic example here is the Serb nationalist leader Slobodan Milosevic, who, you know, played a major role in tearing Yugoslavia apart in the 1990s. This guy was a Serb, but he was also, for much of his career, a Communist Party bureaucrat in a communist system where ethnic and religious identity was not all that emphasized. But he saw that he could rise politically by stoking the grievances of his group, Serbs, Orthodox Serbs, and by painting other groups in the country, Muslims, Croats, Bosniaks, as threatening. And in so doing, he set a different discourse. He set a different tone that made violence acceptable, created a permission structure for unleashing enormous violence, right? I think it's fair to say in our country, since 2016 at least, we have had new elites that have set a different tone and that have signaled to our fellow Americans that new kinds of language and behavior that were not ever, not that these things didn't exist, but that were not acceptable in polite society, they are now, right? And it's very clear that this phenomenon is a piece of the story in understanding how we've seen this rise of violence and threats in the last few years. Last thing I want to say here, and then I'm going to pause, and then we'll wrap up and take some discussion. The other thing that has to be considered here is our democracy it's kind of weird. I mean, there's no other good way to put it. There's a whole discipline called comparative political science where smart people compare different kinds of systems of government, including different kinds of democracies, and to see what you can learn about that. And when you compare our democracy to other types of democracies, our system correlates to systems that are unstable and more prone to violence. Because on the one hand, we have what's called a majoritarian electoral system. So, as an example, you can be elected to Congress if you happen to be in a district that's not all gerrymandered, that's actually competitive. If you win that seat by, 10 votes, you're in. You're a member of Congress, right? You represent the whole district. But the primary process, which tends to produce candidates for the two major parties that are themselves more partisan, maybe more to the extremes, means that you end up with a system where you often get politicians in office whose views tend to be more extreme than where the median American is, right? I assume you've all seen this data. There was a recent article in Axios highlighting some of these survey findings, and these findings are old. If you survey Americans about their views on all these hot button issues, gun control, how would you have a compromise on abortion, 65% of Americans agree on a ton of stuff, right? This has been true forever. But the nature of our political system, right? The fact that one senator can filibuster legislation so that you have to get 60 votes in the Senate, which itself is not particularly representative of the electorate as a whole, to pass major legislation, it's a distorting impact, right? It means that it's hard to get legislation across the finish line that most Americans want. That's an example of what political scientists would call strong minoritarian institutions, right? I mean, the most infamous example in our country is the Electoral College. You can be elected president and not win the most votes, right? I mean, think how different our politics might be if for the Republican Party, if they knew they had to win a national popular vote majority to get into office. I'm guessing it would change the incentives within their political system somewhat. So anyway, we could talk a lot about this, but the bottom line is our system is vulnerable. in ways that, say, a parliamentary system in the UK is not. Okay, so I want to leave you with this. 3 takeaways. First, depending on where you sit, change can be hard. And again, I want to emphasize that this is real normal. It is true. There's evidence to back up this basic phenomenon, this fear of change, fear of status threat across multiple societies and significant chunks of history. More generally, everything we've talked about here, if you've been paying attention, this is real complicated and deep stuff. I would ask that you not give in to despair. Again, you got to tune in next week to get to the happy part. I'm not suggesting that we're all doomed. What I'm suggesting is that given how big this all is, it should lead us to more grace. Understanding this, the reason I'm sharing this is I hope it helps all of us navigate these frustrating conversations with our fellow Americans, who may be friends, family members, neighbors, whatever. Like, we're all buffeted by all of this. And hopefully knowing that and having a little more context for that makes it easier for us to take a deep breath, right? And give people space while we try to engage in these hard discussions. And the last thing I want to say, and this is really important, and it speaks to my day job with the Carter Center, is I think as Americans, I think we can change the incentives. You know, the point I made a moment ago about elite rhetoric, right? And President Trump is an easy example of this phenomenon, right? He began to assert in the summer of 2020 that the only way he could lose that election was because of fraud. Well, why did he do that? Well, because he concluded correctly that Americans have been in a national crisis of mistrust for decades. All he had to do was expand the circle of mistrust into mistrust of election administration. He also knew that his message would be repeated ad nauseum in, relatively closed media systems, right? So what do we do about that? Well, I would argue that we are the silent majority, to quote the one and only Richard Nixon. Most Americans, the survey data backs this up. Please don't lose sight of this. Most Americans believe in our democracy. Most Americans absolutely abhor the idea of violence or threats in our political system. Most Americans want to live in a happy, prosperous country. We are the majority by far. That therefore tells me that our job is to lift up the voices of all the rest of us. Part of what's happened here is that an angry minority, a small minority, seized the debate. They took the microphone. They've made their views seem to represent a larger portion of our country than they actually do. So our job then is to turn that around and tell any candidate for office, you're seeking a school board seat, a Senate seat, whatever, that, hey, we as Americans in Minnesota, pick a state, we disagree on lots of things. That's okay. That's just part of having a democracy, part of living together. But we do agree on some fundamentals. Okay. You cannot demonize your fellow Americans, especially in ways that will make them targets of violence. If you lose an election, you can go to court. That's the American way. Well, we love our lawyers, right? You can have your day in court. That's part of the process. If you also lose in court, you got to go shake hands with the other dude, as we have done for 250 years. And finally, you definitely can't incite violence, right? These are things that as Americans, we've all agreed on for a very, very long time, despite many other differences. So a lot of my day job is trying to build those coalitions that can make that point and make it land and demonstrate that there's an audience, a substantial audience of Americans that want to see better behavior. And that is part of what gives me hope that we can get out of this. So let me stop there. We got 5 more minutes. I can take a last few questions or comments. And I haven't totally been following the chat. So Anna, or if anybody wants to jump in with tell me what's in the chat, that'd be great. All right. Well,
Okay, so I'll kick in here because there's been quite a bit here back and forth with me, Tony, Kelly,
Oh, okay.
Karen, Lori, several in here.
Oh, yeah. All right. Now I found the chat button.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm missing out on the party.
No, that's all right. So recently, the last thing I posted here, I feel like the actual change here requires the system to change, and the system needs to change by the people who benefit the most from the system, right? I mean, yes, I agree that there's this silent majority here of those who are gathered here and probably 9 figures worth of other Americans, but there's this sense of we can't do a whole lot because there's 544 people, if you include the Supreme Court, who comprise the 3 branches of government that run the country. And I remember reading, this was probably 8 or 10 years ago, that there's this sense of my congressional representatives are great. It's everybody else's congressional representatives that are the problem. And it's I can't control what happens with another congressperson who sort of hijacks things and decides to come up here in Minnesota and say, you know what, this is how I feel, this is how I don't feel, but there's no sense of like stay in your lane, right? And in some ways, I feel like that's sort of the attraction of Trump. That just drain the swamp and burn it down is like the system is beyond fixing. So screw it all, blow it all up. I don't care who gets hurt in the process, and let's build something completely new. And I feel like some of those Obama Trump voters you were talking about in 2016 are like, yeah, you're right. Obama was changed, and this guy is changed too. And I think the Democrats really underestimated how many people, like my parents, just hated Hillary. But at the same time, it just feels like we've all got to sort of lay down our own best interests for the good of the country. And again, like going back, maybe there's only a small contingent of people who want to do that. I've talked enough. Sorry, you're the expert.
Well, no, those are you're touching on some really good points. Let me say this. There is I would argue, a crisis in our democracy that long predates 2016, right? We wouldn't, Donald Trump wouldn't have been nominated to be the Republican nominee if we didn't already have some significant problems, if I may be candid, right? I mean, money in politics, gerrymandering, the electoral college, there are all these ways in which the system has grown less representative of what most people want for decades now. So I don't want to minimize any of that. Most of what I just shared, think of that as triage. Think of this as the short-term problem versus the long-term problem. In the short-term problem, we got to ensure that the country doesn't burn down in the next 9 months. Honestly, like we got to execute a peaceful transfer of power. That in no way is meant to downplay the enormous hard work of trying to make the system more responsive, which we need. And, one of the reasons we're in this mess, and again, the comparative political scientists will tell you this, our Constitution is uniquely difficult to amend. I mean, most other countries, they've just been able to respond to more demands for popular representation over, decades and centuries, because their systems were easier to change. Ours is uniquely hard to change. So I don't want to sugarcoat how challenging that is. But I would say American history is also full of examples of us expanding the franchise, right? Senators used to be elected by state legislators. Women didn't used to have the right to vote, right? I mean, it is very much in our history, and I would argue in our national DNA, that we can reform this system. We can further reform it to ensure that it better represents the interests of most of the rest of us. But any other thought? I know we're at time. Antoine and Anna, I'll defer to you guys if we should. I could talk for a few more minutes, but I know we're at time.
I think you're fine to continue going on, and anyone who needs to step away can step away.
My kids had pancakes for dinner, so I think things are quiet downstairs. So I'm just looking at the comments in the chat. Does it transfer power mean there will be no second term for President Biden? Oh, I don't know. I mean, I think it could go either way. Christina, I'm looking at your comment. Yeah, your point about your neighbors and it sharing a place together. Yeah, that's really important. And I didn't say this explicitly, but I think one piece of what's happened in our country in recent years, but this is also a longer term trend, is social atomization and social isolation, right? If you go back to Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone, that book came out in 2000. That book is ancient history by now. And back then, he had all this data on how the frequency with which Americans were inviting other people over for dinner, that had declined. Joining bowling leagues, right? Joining, social clubs, like all of that was down in 2000. And then, of course, we've had the pandemic, we've had the rise of all these communication technologies that perhaps give us the illusion of believing we don't have to go, literally rub shoulders with our fellow Americans, right? So I think this relationship building and trust building is important at every level. And if you want to pick, I know it's big, as I said, this is bigger than all of us, right? If you want to pick a place to start, and we will talk more about this next week, start in your neighborhood. That really matters. And the last thing I'd say on that is, if you want to think about resilience to violence, keeping yourself safe, I am not exaggerating, get to know your neighbors. Get to know your neighbors, right? I mean, it's very important to have some element of trust. You don't have to be best friends, right? But having those social ties that go beyond, just occasionally seeing each other on the sidewalk, that's very important. Yeah, Kelly, your point that's really, really well put. And we need to see our opposition as opposition, not mortal enemies.
I had one question.
Sure.
Nathan, this is awesome. Thank you so much. Not to channel my inner Lisa Simpson, but do you have any homework for us? Anything that we could read? Any little exercise we could do? Anything to prime us for next week? Even if it's somebody we should just follow. Just anything off the top of your mind we can do to keep things going in our mind between now and next week.
That's a very thoughtful question, Dan. I'll send these slides to Anna, I guess, but I would also, just give me 1 second. I'm going to drop just one of these footnotes in the chat, and it is to a web link that, in theory, you can just click on it and anybody can read it. It's an article by a scholar and practitioner by the name of Rachel Kleinfeld. Here. It's from this past fall. I mean, it's maybe 6 months old. And if you were going to read one thing, it's fairly long, but it is first of all a literature review. She reviews 20 or 30 years of political science that, going back years, was trying to answer this question: why are we becoming more polarized? Right? It started in the 90s, right? And so there were people back in the 90s trying to figure this out, right? So it's this first one here, although the piece by McCoy is also good, but the first one, the rise of political violence in the United States. Oh, no, I'm sorry, guys. Sorry, bear with me. That's not the article I was looking for. 1 second. This one. I mean, you can read all of these, but this one, Polarization, Democracy, and Political Violence, what the research says. This is a great primer on this whole thing, because she gets into the polarization piece. How did this happen? How did we think about it over time, right? We had theories about why this was happening in 2000 that haven't stood the test of time, and now we're like, no, it's not what we thought that. But she lays all that out, and then she does a very nice job of getting into the violence piece. Why America? So if you were going to read one thing, Dan, I'd read this.
I clicked on this and it says page not found on the Carnegie website.
I just clicked on it and it popped right up for me. Let me drop this version of the link in the chat. Try that.
I clicked on it in the first one and got there.
Okay.
So did I.
I'm on a
I can
Mac.
also include it in an email. I can include that as well.
Yeah. Any other questions? We'll give it one last question, and then I probably should get on to dad duty.
Great. Well, I will call it because I do want to respect your time and know that you need to kick it with your family. But just want to say thank you so much, Nathan. For all of you who attended, thanks so much. I will be sending out a survey as well as the slides and the recording, and we will see you all next week to get some skills and what it looks like to help overcome polarization. So enjoy the rest of your night.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for
Thank
coming
you.
out.